Welcome back to the Fantasy Hockey Podcast. We have the draft strategy episode for you today. One of the most exciting ones of the season. I think this is the one everyone kind of waits for and tunes into. There's a lot to go over. And with such a weird season upcoming, I feel like there's a lot of interesting strategy discussion to be had. Now, to go over this episode a little bit, the way we're going to structure it is it's less about what player to take. So we're not going to say like, okay, Leon Draisaitl, would you take him first overall? And what about like Vasilevsky? Do you take him? No, that's not really what we're looking at. We're looking at a position thing. So like, where would you take positions? How do you deal with early in the draft? What would you do early in the draft? What do you do more in the middle of the draft? When do you start to worry about banger stats? Like that type of strategy. Not so much like the specific, where do I take this player? That's not what this episode is going to be answering. It's going to be more for how do you navigate the actual draft itself and when do you make decisions? When do you go high risk? When do you try to play it safe? That sort of thing. And then what we're going to do as well is we might talk a little bit about specific players, but we're going to talk about positions. And the most important thing, this is the most important thing for your draft strategy. Okay. Here's the number one trick. Know your settings in and out. Have no doubts in your mind of what a hit is worth. Have no doubts in your mind of what your cat settings are. You'd be shocked. I know this sounds stupid and it sounds so common sense, but the amount of times in a season that we will get asked what they should do, what a person should do, and they don't know their settings or don't actually know how to play for their settings is shocking to me. You need to know your settings. You need to know if you count hits heavily. You need to know what your banger stats are relative to your point stats. Like if you have 3 point stats and only 1 banger stat, like those point stats matter a lot more. So you got to know what you're playing in. It's the most important part of your draft strategy. That is the number one thing I can tell you. And I know, again, it sounds really dumb, but if you're a beginner, that's the most important part. Don't just draft because of the big name on the board. Don't just draft because you know a player's name, but you are drafting for banger stats. That's not how it works. You got to know all the names. Sorry, Brandon. By the way, I actually have a co-host called Brandon on this podcast. He occasionally does talk. Sometimes he just giggles on the side and lets me ramble. But he is here. He also does drink a lot of water, and because we have the video, you can see that. So that's a little bit of a rundown of how the show is going to go. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. So I think the first place here to start with, and this is Brandon's favorite, I think, part of the draft normally, I'll be honest, is the part he gets the most right, is the early rounds. So we're thinking the first 3 to the first 4 rounds. So what do you do specifically in those first 4 rounds? Because really, I think it's the same whether you're in a points league, in a rotisserie league, in a cats league. It doesn't matter. Your strategy in these first 4 rounds stays the same, right?
Oh yeah. For me, the key thing about what I'm going to do in the early rounds, maybe up till even round 5 potentially. I think 5 is where things start to shift potentially, depending on who's available. But I don't gamble in the first 4 rounds. I think if you're in our Discord, it's something I say pretty often when people are talking about who they should take in the 3rd or the 4th specifically. It seems to come up a lot. I'm pretty bearish on any super young players. If you listen to this pod a few years ago, I was very against Line A early on just because, I mean, he was being like first round rated for the first round and being taken in the first round. It's like, we don't really have a book on this guy. He had a great season, but we just don't really know. So I tend to shy away a little bit from younger players, and I'll go after players that have been established enough. I know we're not really going to go into necessarily specifics, but a player that's standing out to me right now is Cale Makar. Like, as much as I like him, I'm not going to take him in the second. So, I mean, I could be wrong about it. I would be the first to admit I could be wrong about it. But the player that I will wind up taking in my second round is somebody that I feel pretty confident their floor is very high. And I think that's key. I don't know really what Makar's floor is. I don't know what happens if he has a bad streak. So that's kind of like that's the point. I'm probably going to lean to, somebody that's been in the league for at least 3 seasons ish of consistently good production.
And when you mentioned the bit about not gambling, that's kind of what you mean is playing it safe. Like you want to play it safe in these first 4
High
rounds.
floor
And
is more important than high ceiling in
yes.
the beginning rounds.
Yeah. So that's
You're not going to pick I mean, you could. This goes with gambling, but
yeah.
your odds are if you take a typical top player, you're not going to wind up with somebody that has a low floor,
Yeah.
and you shouldn't really be risking it because you don't really need. It's the funny thing. You don't need your superstars to be above
Incredible.
their pay grade. You need them to be
No.
what you expect them to be. So
Yeah.
the gambling comes in the mid rounds when you're really looking for,
Yeah.
an overlooked player or whatever, or an up and comer, but not in the beginning.
And that's something you'll hear, I think, in this episode a lot that we'll talk about is this concept of a floor and a ceiling and where to target guys. And when you're looking at these first few rounds, what you're looking for is your highest floor. And I'd argue in any draft, what you're trying to do is increase your floor. Because the higher your floor is, sure, you want to manage, right, that ceiling too. You don't want like a high-ish floor but a really high ceiling too, right? Because then you're kind of in this weird middle ground where you can't really compete and take over weeks, and that sucks. So you want to maintain this high ceiling while giving yourself the highest floor possible. And so in these first few rounds, what you're trying to do is increase your floor as much as possible because, like Brandon's saying, they don't need to be above their pay grade. They don't. It's okay if you miss out on Draisaitl in a way in this first round, right? Like, yeah, you might bang your head on a wall being like, oh, I could have gotten Draisaitl last year, but you don't need him. That's the thing, is if you would have taken Ovechkin, you did okay still. You should have done okay. Because what it does is that when you play it safe in these first 4 rounds and you increase your floor, it gives you room for a few things. In the draft itself, it gives you room to gamble a little more later. Because you can be sure, you can know that Ovechkin is as best as you can, right, in fantasy, knowing and actually having knowledge that this is going to happen. Because, of course, there's some luck involved, right? But as best as you can, you know what Ovechkin's going to do for you, especially in the peripheral department more than anything. So you increase your peripheral floor if you're in a bangers league immediately, or if you're in a points peripherals league, you know you're going to get these auxiliary stats at least, right? So there's this floor, which means you can gamble later, or it means that later on you can gamble a little bit more in the points department. And where it really, really helps you is in those middle weeks of the season where players are slumping, you have this high floor that can keep you up and keep you competitive at all times. And also, it allows you to gamble a little bit when it comes to those pickups. So when you make your pickups, you don't need to worry as much because your floor is already there. So you can target specific categories, or you can target specific weak points in your points league. Like for me, for example, in my points league, goalies are a very high risk, high reward game. You get absolutely crushed if they have a bad game, but you just destroy if they have a good game normally. But you do need that middle ground safety net with your players to allow you to play that swing. Otherwise, you're just playing the swing and then you're going to end up like 7th place. But if you play it right, you could end up 1st or you end up like 4th. Right? And so that's where that comes into play. Now, I'm going to segue this now away from this concept of drafting really safe in the first round. And I want to talk a little bit about what you do from like a coverage perspective in the first few rounds. Right? Because I think me and you, in a way, I think have a little bit of a similar philosophy in this, especially if you're in a categories league. Like, what do you do if you have 2 guys sort of similar, right? But one is just like sort of similar in rank. One gets you a lot of points. The other one doesn't get you as many points, but gives you more coverage. Let's compare, for example, I think 2 good examples are, let's compare Connor McDavid and Alexander Ovechkin normally in a bangers league, right? So if you're in a bangers league, you have Alex Ovechkin, Connor McDavid. Which one are you taking and why?
So there's a few reasons to take Ovechkin, in my opinion. The first one, especially if you're in a league where the positions are broken out, I'm already stepping myself back, but where left wing, center, and right wing are broken out, there's a little bit of value there. Although I'll be the first to say, don't base your first pick on position because you can figure that out later on. Although, I mean, McDavid's a special player, so
very special.
And being a center doesn't really affect his value.
But again, that's the point, right? Don't think about the fact the center is really deep, so you shouldn't take a center there.
Yeah, and it does depend on your league a bit. So in standard Yahoo leagues, let's ignore plus minus. You wind up with goals, assists, shots, hits, and blocks, right? And power play points. In that, I think they're fairly close. But if you add Pims, I mean, Ovi doesn't get a ton of Pims, but maybe that bumps him a little bit. I think they're pretty close, honestly. I think you could take either one and be fine, but Ovechkin gives you a lot of flexibility down the roster. So if you take Ovi early, you know you're going to have elite coverage off the bat, and you don't have to worry about. You could take somebody like a Barzell later on if you're looking for a point getter. So it opens up a little bit of different avenues for you to go. That said, like I wouldn't fault anybody for taking McDavid over Ovi. It's just a personal choice. I like in a banger Cats league, I like Ovi just because I know no matter what direction the draft goes, by the time it comes back to me, there's going to be a player on the board that is going to be like a top 2 or 3 choice for me. And I'm not going to be like, I'm not going to have a pure point getter and be like, oh crap, Brady Tkachuk and Evander Kane went off the board already. And now what do I do? I'm going to have to figure out my peripherals when there's like guys like Mark Stone hanging around and like they're just kind of doing what I already have. So there's a lot to think about there, but again, I don't think you can necessarily go wrong with either one. I prefer Ovi.
Same.
Just because I think the coverage is so hard to find.
And that's, I think, something to think about as well when you're drafting is never draft. When you're drafting, you got to think ahead a little bit. You can't only look at what's going on in that moment and draft right there, right? Like you look at a player, it looks really sexy. Remember, people like to touch nice things, and you just want to grab the nicest player, right? Seems fine, but you got to think ahead on composition. Like Brandon's saying, that's a really important thing in banger leagues. Say you get Ovechkin, you open up a lot of opportunities down the line because now where do I go? Do I go down the points route, like all points? Or do I go down this other route where now I need to target banger stats, right? If you get a McDavid, your points are pretty set. You are already the best in the league, essentially, in points. So now you got to target bangers. So now when you're getting down to that second round, like Brandon's saying, you better hope a Brady Tkachuk or Evander Kane falls to you or gets to you. Right?
There's an interesting notion to take here as well. I think a lot of people kind of combine the idea of points. And in points leagues, that's fine, right? Points leagues are a different beast. But in categories leagues, if you take Ovi, what are you really losing to McDavid? You're ahead in goals, almost certainly. You're way behind in assists, almost certainly.
Way behind.
But you're way ahead in shots and hits, and probably behind, and almost certainly behind in power play points.
Well, you could compete in power play points on a given week, though.
You could. So you look at that like aggregate. And you basically wind up with Ovi having more categories, but he doesn't have quite the gap on goals that McDavid has on assists. But by taking Ovi, you can kind of, crazy as it sounds, you can punt assists. That's actually how my team worked last season. I think I had Ovi. Pretty sure I had Ovi. And I had, my assists were terrible. I must have been last in the league in assists, but I was consistently near the top in goals and shots and hits. And so I just kind of like realized early on in my draft, I had an OV early, and then I don't remember who I got with the second round, but I didn't have OV. I took Vasilevsky last season, but regardless, the first time ever I've taken a goalie in the first round, but I was on the 11th spot. Yeah, but basically, just because you have a point score doesn't necessarily mean you need to keep. You need to win goals and assists. You can do that, but it's not something that has to happen in a Cats league.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I like the idea of taking a guy. I normally will actually prioritize sort of being even across the board as I go because your floor is just higher. You have the best coverage guys. Yeah, maybe I'm not going to be the best in goal. And that's the thing actually in categories, which is kind of interesting from a draft strategy perspective. You don't want to be the best. So this is a good opportunity actually as well to tell you that we have a draft tool if you don't already use it. There should be a video soon on our YouTube. If you're watching this later, closer to the new year, there's already one on there on how to use the tool. But our draft tool allows you to import, let's say you get Dom or Dauber's projections. You can import those to give you ranks. It comes with Scott Cullen's projections and with daily faceoffs projections as well in there already built in. But what it does is it tells you as you're drafting where you are relative to the rest of the league in certain categories. So how do you fare in goals? How do you fare in assists? How do you fare in hits versus the rest of the league? Because that's who you're competing with, right? In each category. And when you look at it at the end of the draft, you don't want to be over indexed in any. You don't want to be in the red in hits, but then in the super, super green of goals. What's the point in that? That's not how it is. You want to be competitive in every single category. So you want to be even across the board. You want to be towards the top. Granted, yes, you do. But you don't want to blow people out of the water in one to sacrifice another, unless you, like Brandon, punt one category. That's fine. If you punt one category, cool. But you've got to be pretty even across the board. The worst teams, normally, always in a season that I've seen when I plug in the stats, are always the ones that are super heavy in the points departments and suck in the categories departments, in the like peripheral departments. And the same with points, honestly. When I'm in a points league, and I do this same thing to see where my points are coming from. If all your points are coming just from points, it's a little bit of a dangerous proposition once you get down to the later rounds, right? Because if you're doing that later on, you better hope those guys keep scoring points normally, because otherwise you're in a lot of trouble. So normally you want to be pretty balanced in the sense of where the contribution comes from week to week, because it means you can weather the storm when people might not hit, when people might not score goals. You can weather the storm or at least attack in other areas, right? And the same goes for points. Where do you attack? If I have a team that's very balanced and has a really high floor in points leagues, you know what that means is every single week, I just need to pick up hitters. I just need to pick up floor guys, and I do okay normally. Very rarely am I going out and attacking and needing the highest point getter ever to get me a win. No, I'm normally winning by a decent margin, or I'm losing just barely because my guy, for whatever reason, they got lucky and got a few extra points. At least that's how it went for me last season for the most part. One week I had to get blown out. But that's because Bob got like a negative 20. So
that's what you get.
We don't talk about that though. So anyways, so that's the strategy there, I think, in terms of categories. You want to be pretty balanced in these first 4 rounds. I do like, when we talk about defensemen, I do like getting one top defenseman in my first 4 rounds. I try to target some sort of defenseman there. Who? It depends on who's available at each round, but I like to leave out of the first 4 rounds with a defenseman normally.
Yeah, I would say typically goalies are the weird one for me. I do typically think at the latest, the 5th is where my first defenseman comes, but it varies quite a bit on your league. I think, and when you look, so there's another concept I feel like has gotten quite popular this season, is the value over replacement concept, and that has value in points leagues, but it doesn't have nearly as much in cats leagues. It's really hard to
it's
quantify.
Tougher to nail down. Yeah,
what's that?
It's tougher to nail down what the value of a replacement is in a cats league for a defenseman, especially.
You can really, especially in a bangers. This is again why we advocate for bangers league so much. If you don't know what that means, it means adding things like shots, hits, blocks, penalty minutes potentially, if that's not super contentious in your league. You can easily build a team that is points and shots focused up front, and then straight up nothing but PIMs, hits, and blocks in the back end. That's totally viable, and those defensemen will come cheaper. So it's hard to really gauge what value over replacement means in a cats leagues. In a points league, I think it does really boost the value of top tier defensemen on good scoring teams compared to what it does on cats leagues.
If you're a beginner listening to this, I mean, even if you know what you're doing and you don't pay attention to this, there is one stat, even if you don't count it, that matters the most for both forwards and defensemen. Honestly, it matters more for defensemen. It's something you should pay attention to, but there's one stat that is the most rare once you get out of the top rounds, and that is power play points.
Yep.
Power play points are the hardest to fix. If you are screwed in power play points come round 5, according to, say, the draft tool we built, quite frankly, you're probably just screwed. It's going to be
you might just want to punt
you're
at
just
that point.
You probably need to punt it. But the problem is, here's the problem with punting power play points, though. Power play points are tied to goals and assists as well.
Yep.
And so if you're doing poorly in power play points, there's a very, very good chance you're probably doing poorly in points as well. And the problem with that is that you also don't have upside. Power play point opportunity gives you a lot of upside because that's where a lot of free points come from. Just man advantage. Why not? And what it also does, at least for defensemen, is it dictates the offensive time that a defenseman has to get in on points. Normally, when a defenseman is getting high power play points, because they play a lot of time on the power play. So normally on these first 4 rounds, when I'm targeting a defenseman, I like coverage, right? I'm going for coverage, but that's not necessarily what I do. I look for a power play point defenseman. Power play 1, I'm looking at the Yossi's, the Cale Makars, the Quinn Hughes, these guys who are just staples on the top power play. And when you're a staple on the top power play, that's what I want in my first 4 rounds. Is one guy like that. Because say you're playing with 4 defensemen, normally the way I try to target it is with defensemen at least. And I know we're kind of jumping all over the place here and not sticking to the top round. And sorry, we're taking so long in the top round. It's hard to mess up the top round, honestly, but there's still a lot to talk about. But anyways, so you have 4 defenseman slots. Normally the way I like to structure it is I like to structure one top power play defenseman for sure. I don't really care if they get coverage. It's preferred. Like I would love to get Yossi or I'd love to get Dougie Hamilton because they offer so much more. But if it happened to be a Quinn Hughes or something, I'm not bothered. Then the second spot, I like it to be a guy with coverage, but still getting me power play points. Normally, the way I like to do it is 2 power play point defensemen or 2 point defensemen, right? Where I know I'm going to get points from them. And then 2 defenseman slots that are good for streaming bangers and that specifically add coverage in these ulterior or these other areas of stats. That's normally how I structure my defensive kind of team when I have 4. And normally I won't have a defenseman on the bench. Sometimes in a blocks league, I will have a defenseman on the bench.
It really, in those leagues, it kind of just depends on what shows up in the later rounds for me. I do in the late, if we're going to stick on defenseman for the time being, I do in the late rounds, I like to take stabs at guys that I think might get a shot somewhere.
Yeah.
Philip Pronic was a stab last season.
Good one too.
Yeah. He was like up and down, but
eventually,
yeah. And then I think like an example of a good stab this season is my boy Jacob Chikrin. I actually think is a pretty good stab.
Chikrin is a good stab. He is.
So it's just, I think when you're looking down that far,
Pionk is a good stab too. He's going around the 9th
but
round.
he's not that. People know about him now.
Yeah, but he's going 9th round right now still.
Yeah, it's
pretty
low.
Shea Theodore is an interesting one later on in the 8th round. He's going right now. But anyways, yeah. So if we take a look I'm just looking right now at like where the draft kind of starts to fall off, and it looks like at about the 8th round you're starting to fall off on like true. I mean, Shea Weber at 8th round feels kind of like a steal, although they do a split thing with Petrie, whatever. So anyways, I think at around the 7th round is when I'm seeing guys that are just locks for the power play fall off. So that's where like Dahlin goes. And then after that, it's Klingberg, Barry, Shea Theodore, Weber, Pionk.
You still have Yandel,
D'Angelo,
but like Yandel's very one-dimensional.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is like after 7 is where like these guys, I don't know if they'd hold the top power play spot. Chabot
probably will.
I just want to say this right now. Chabot in the 10th round is a steal. I think that's a steal.
That's for a different episode, sir. We still have to talk
absurd.
about.
I know. I'm just saying. Now that I'm looking at this, okay, that's a gut reaction that I'm just putting out there into the universe. It's absurd to me. He's still going that late after the season he had last year, and he was a steal last year too. So, anyways, that's what I try to prioritize there. Now let's move into kind of the middle rounds, where I normally like to take goalies. I don't mind taking a goalie in the 5th round. That's normally when I do it. But there's this thing that we call, let's talk about goalies for a second, actually, before going into these middle rounds, because they kind of coincide. There's this thing that we like to call the goalie run. If you don't know what the goalie run is, there's always the guy who takes a goalie in the 1st round or the 2nd round. And those are anomalies. There's people who take them there. And people kind of sit on the sidelines, right? But then you get to the 3rd or 4th rounds. Someone takes a goalie. The next person freaks out and thinks the goalie's going to go next. So they take a goalie. And then another goalie goes, and you're sitting there in like the 7th spot, and you're like, oh my God, all the goalies are going to be gone. And then another goalie goes, and you just sit there and you're like, oh my God, the goalie run is happening. And so that's what the goalie run is. Now, how do you approach it? My take is that you never want to start a goalie run, and you also never want to end it. You never want to be the tail end of it, and you also never want to be the beginning of it. In the sense that if you are the end of it, you're probably better off just waiting for goalies, honestly, at that point and figuring it out.
Which is my opinion for the season anyway. But
yeah, I think there's a lot of value at the end. I think people are going to reach for guys like Samsonov. And the thing is that normally when you hold off on goalies, especially during the goalie run, and especially the earlier they happen in your league, if the goalie run happens in around like the 6th or 7th round, sometimes I'll take part because by then there's not that many great options sometimes that have fallen to you. Um, but if say a goalie run is happening like the 4th round, there's a lot of good players still in the 4th round.
Yep.
There's a lot of really, really good players that go in the 4th round. Gabriel Landeskog could fall there. Matthew Tkachuk could fall in there. Patrice Bergeron is around there. You got Blake Wheeler going down there. There's
Pasternak's
really
there somehow, which is insane.
There is really good value in those 4th rounds. And so there is value to waiting out this goalie run and taking skaters and just picking off people that, for whatever reason, is being left on the board.
Yeah.
And that's what we advocated for last season, too.
This season's unique in that way, in that I think, and I don't necessarily think this will stop with this season. I think we're going to see a rise in split starts anyway, but or at least an increase in backups taking more starts and less of the 70 game playing starting goalies that we've seen in days old. But I thought this last season, I think even more for this season, that you can really wait to the late rounds and still have pretty good availability there. I mean, just at a glance here, you've got like Mackenzie Blackwood. I mean, he's not like a beautiful player as far as like somebody you have to take, but
excuse me, Mackenzie Blackwood is a good looking man.
Sure. But he may not get you wins, but his stats were decent last season. And depending on what your league settings are, he can get you by. We actually plan to play wins, saves, save percentage this season. Because we're trying to keep people in our league to continue to hold 2 goalies. Last season, the correct, I think, strategy was to just take one goalie and kind of flyer it with your second one. Have one good starting goalie and then kind of stream in and out your, or one good starting goalie and stream in and out your second goalie when you need them. So we kind of want to avoid that this season and try to get people to hold 2 goalies all season if we can do that. So
there's a lot of value late in goalies this year, especially. I mean, John Gibson is going 13th round, 13 and a half. He's going 149 ADP. That's great. You've got Semyon Varlamov going 14th round. You got Ilya Sorokin going all the way back to 15th round. Like, there's a lot of good. Pecorine is down 14. There's a lot of really good value late this year that you can take. I mean, Corey Crawford is out there, I guess, if you want.
I don't mind Koskinen,
for example,
at that late too, especially in a points league if wins are really a heavy favorite.
Yeah. So it's interesting. There's a lot of for example, the other guy too there's some backups. Halak is going around like I think 11th round or something like that.
Yeah, you got Demko right there too in the 13th.
Yeah, there's some really good late round value, and so this year especially, I think I'm gonna wait off on goalies for sure. Yeah, I think I'm gonna take advantage of the fact. I think that I'm gonna take advantage of the fact that there's gonna be a goalie run. People are gonna freak out. And I think there's going to be more split starts, so there's less value in holding a top goaltender unless it's like a Hellebuck, who you know is going to start and there's no one behind him, or Vasilevsky. Yeah, those are really the only 2 that I see that maybe matter. Maybe Samsonov moves into that conversation now, but the thing with Samsonov, Carter Hart too. Yeah, Carter Hart for sure. He's there too because Brian Elliott is behind him. I wouldn't even put Carey Price in that realm anymore either. I think Montreal said last year they really wanted to rest Carey Price more. And they made a show of that and went and got Jake Allen. Whether that was a good choice or not, Allen's good now. He's gotten better. I don't know. And another guy, for example, that's going to get a lot of starts is Matt Murray. I mean, his glove hand is awful, but still, the point is, there's goalies late. I don't think there is value this year to jumping into the goalie run and overreacting. I think this year there's a lot of value in waiting, taking advantage of the skaters early who will get you points, and then making up those goalie stats later, I think. And last year I was a big advocate last year for taking, I mean, even Bobrovsky's going really late. I know there's a lot of good starting goaltenders that are going late, much later than normal. And I think you're going to be able to wait and do really, really well still at the end. And last year I advocated for a goalie early. I think I had good reasoning back then for it, and it did work out. Like, I got Hellebuck early in 3 leagues, and that worked out really, really well for me. I just saw it as a different I just saw it as there was a lot of value to taking a goaltender up top last year. And I think it worked out for the most part. I could see both strategies worked. I mean, Brandon's goaltending strategy also got him a little bit far. But
That's
this
because I
year
just
for
targeted
sure,
the Islander goalies, which worked out.
yeah, that worked out really well for you. But this year, I'm definitely sitting tight until kind of towards the end, and maybe running 3 goalies this year. Actually, I think is kind of one thing I'm thinking about.
Yeah. So
one of the thoughts.
the grander mid-round strategy, I think, like for points leagues, honestly, the drafting for a points league is not terribly difficult. Like
No.
the top in the top rounds, be safe. In the mid rounds, try to find your breakout candidates, but it's not like you're really trying to form a complete team. Points leagues is just points. So in a Cats league, in the mid rounds is when you need to look at your team composition and figure out what needs improving and what you need. This is where, like, if you're using the tool, you should be taking a look. 6th round starts. You should be taking stock of the other teams in the league and figuring out where you are relative to them, where you're lacking, and if you've already kind of accidentally or otherwise built in a punt. If you've gone this far and you have hits and you're just way, way, way behind in hits, maybe hits just aren't going to be it, or PIMs or something. Yeah. So it's I think the mid rounds are really where you build the composition of your team. The top rounds, it's, in my opinion, it's get the best player available. And you can kind of define that how you will, but there's not a whole lot of, like, you don't really need to overthink it too much. Try not to get a bust candidate and then, round out in the mid rounds, and then the late rounds is just funsies. And anything in the double digits, I think all bets are off. You can do whatever you want.
Hey, I took Bobrovsky in the 2nd round last year and still got pretty far. So yeah, you can do a bust and still do pretty fine. But the way you do that is, like Brandon said, in these middle rounds is where you're building out your team. You're taking stock of where you're at and say, like you said, right, if you're low in hits, who do you target that's left that is going to help me out in hits and also help me out in other places? So in the middle rounds is where you're especially looking for coverage. For example, that's where sometimes I love when guys like Wheeler fall to me, because they just offer so much coverage across the board. And granted, sometimes he can fall to like the 5th round or something like that. But in the middle rounds, that's kind of why I don't like guys like Johnny Gaudreau in Cats leagues, especially. It's so one-dimensional. It puts you in a tough spot later, because the bigger the hole you make it, right? Like, say you don't get coverage early. And I know you're saying take best player, and I agree with that to an extent. But at a certain point, you do need to think about it, because say I take a Johnny Gaudreau and a Connor McDavid, I've dug myself such a peripheral hole that once I'm getting to this 6th, 7th round, I'm looking at it as, well, crap, I need to make up so many hits. I kind of got to reach for a hitter, or I kind of need to just focus on.
I don't know if he's necessarily a top guy in a Cats league anyway.
I mean, he's a 5th round. In standard leagues, he's going 5th. He's going like 4th, 5th round on ADP. So it's still someone that I'm saying, like,
points leagues where he makes a lot more sense. But yeah,
sure. But in those those first rounds, my point still stands, where it's like, if you go really point heavy, say you get Krug too as your defenseman, right? Like, you're just looking at a situation where you're digging yourself a very deep hole that's hard to get out of. And it's not even about holes in terms of getting out of. I'm saying holes a lot. Brandon loves the word holes. Yep. The other issue is that it really puts you in a pickle on where you can pick and what you can do from a decision standpoint. Now you might have a point scorer that falls to you, but do you take him? Probably not. Do you aim for a Barzell? Probably not. Or what if you go really heavy on the peripheral department? Well, now you better hope that there's point guys. I will say this. It is easier to get yourself out of a peripheral hole than it is a points hole. Do not get yourself into a power play point and points hole early, because points and power play points are the hardest thing to make up later. But it's really hard to find hitters later that also get you points. So it's again, balance, right? That's the most important part. By the way, a little freebie for anyone that, I'll say this again on the show. We say this every year, but if you're in a face-off wins league, please target what's his face, Ryan O'Reilly.
Oh yeah,
it's like I never understand why he goes so late in face-off win leagues. Ryan O'Reilly's a beast in so many categories. Plus, he gets you face-off win, elite face-off wins. He's in a face-off leagues, a face-off wins league. He might be borderline top 3 rounds. Just putting that out there, even though he's a center. And I
He
know
needs to
center
shoot
is
more.
deep.
I don't know what happened
Still.
with him last season, but he wasn't
Yeah,
shooting.
that was the only thing that was weird. But he did get points last year.
Yeah.
So he did well there. But anyways, so that's your middle round. Build out your team. Pay attention to relative to everyone else, especially. That's the big part, is how are you relative to everyone else? It's not just your team. But if everyone else is weak in hits too, you can kind of pay attention and be like, okay, hold on. We're all kind of even there. I don't really need to over-index in that area, right? And that's where the tool comes in handy, is relative to everyone else. So you look at it and you say, okay, well, goals, I'm a little weak, but like everyone else is really close to me. Like if, say, just relative strength, because that's how the tool is. And if you're listening to this, it might get a little confusing, but say you're at like a 10.9 strength in goals and you're fourth compared to everybody else, but everyone else is like 11.1, 11.2, 11. You're not far off. Right? You might be fourth in goals, but like you're competitive. You're right there. You don't need to over-index. Go for a goal guy just because you're down there. And so it's all relative to everybody else. And that's what these middle rounds are for, is plugging holes and figuring out, okay, how do I be competitive everywhere, but address areas of a little bit of concern. And like you said, a points league, much more straightforward. Just go for the best guys. And also, one thing I like to do in the middle rounds, it's a little bit contentious. I know when I did my points draft last year on YouTube, a lot of people found this kind of contentious, but I tend to go also in the middle round, especially the later middle rounds. I think we're talking like maybe eighth, 10th round. I try to go for guys who have consistent points coming back to me. So say big hitters, guys that just are good peripheral guys that normally in a points league get really overlooked because people are like, oh, points league, I need goals and assists, and that's the sexy thing. But then you look at guys that don't get that many points but get you a lot of peripherals, and they give you a consistent average night in and night out. Like an Edler gives you a consistent 2 points, at least in my league, gives you consistent 2 points every night without points. And then the points are just a cool upside. And that is huge in a points league when you're getting consistency week in and week out from a guy. Consistency is massive in a points league. So that is the one thing I will say. Take a look at where your points are coming from, and also don't forget about the peripherals, because that'll give you consistency. People shoot every game. People hit every game, right? And so that gives you consistency and keeps you competitive every single week, and helps buffer those weeks where you might not get as many points from your guys, or the shooting percentage might dip a little bit. And the last thing I'll say here on this is, after you get out of that like 8th round, this year it might be earlier than this actually, but normally when you get out of like the 8th round, assume almost everyone after that might be dropped at some point.
I would say the 10th, but yeah.
This
I feel like
last year was 8th
maybe
for me.
when somebody starts getting dropped, but not most of them will be.
Yeah, I think it's an assume like, okay, now we're gonna start going a little bit like, we're gonna be a little bit more risky now. We're gonna go for a little bit of a higher ceiling because these guys might get dropped, right? Like we're looking at Ivan Provorov in the 9th round, someone that realistically could get dropped. Tony DeAngelo going 9th round, absurd, honestly, but could get dropped, right? Like just looking at these guys that Jakob Vrana, I think it is, right? It's guys that maybe might not have the season you're expecting, and you end up dropping them. So it's around the 10th round that you're really looking at guys and saying, I might drop them anyways, so whatever. So that's where you start to go really high ceiling, and you just try to go with the guys that might break out. That's where I might, that's where I look at the guys like Bjorkstrand, and they get really exciting for reaches. Because if I'm going to drop someone in the 10th round anyways, well, I might as well reach for the guy I think might be a breakout candidate.
Yeah. I think this is like last season, a lot of names came to mind, like Anthony Mantha, who for some reason is still rated really low this season. Rope Hintz was an interesting one who took off at the beginning of the season. The rookies, Lafreniere this season, but also like Hughes and Gusev and all those guys last season. None of them worked out, but that's kind of the risk you're willing to take at that point. I think that we saw really good breakout candidate. Kyle Connor in our league last season went like 11th round or something. There was definitely some good value to be found late, and that's where you can try to find players that either got a boost for some reason, somebody left the team, or they are slated to play top power play this time and they didn't last season, or they have a better deployment, or they're just a little older. Somebody that comes to mind for this season is like Anthony Beauvillier, who we saw start breaking out in the playoffs for the Islanders last season. Not the best team in the world to be doing anything fantasy wise, but he's turning, I think, 24 now. He's like right in line for a decent season, I think. So it's just these players that are kind of on an uptrend are the ones that to be paying attention to in those rounds. I don't know where Kevin Fiala is, but I feel like the eighth, somewhere between the 8th and 10th is a good spot to be targeting him. He may be going higher, I don't know, but
that's now. There's a lot of value to be had. So I've seen very often in drafts, especially ones I've been in, I've noticed that very often people tend to cruise. A lot of people tend to go into cruise control after the 10th round and be like, okay, well, the hardest part of the draft is over. Now I just, screw around and have fun. Take whoever. Yeah. In my opinion, you win your drafts after the 10th round. That's when it gets fun. That's where you find true value of people that are falling that have potential to offer a lot. Like Brandon's saying, right, the guys that we mentioned last season that had a lot of potential. Oliver Bjorkstrand going in the 15th round is absurd to me. There's a lot of value there. Alex Edler in the 15th round is a lot of value. There's a lot of good goalie value like we've talked about. There's Rope Hintz in the 14th round. There's a lot of guys that I look at and I'm saying, you know what? They're going really late, but there's a lot of value still. There's a lot of opportunity for one of these guys to become a true kind of roster player. There's a lot of guys that I really, really like late. And so I would advise for you when you get into these late rounds, that's when you dial in. And you don't dial in the first 3 rounds. The first 3 rounds are easy. They should be easy. If you've looked at the numbers, if you've done your research, if you know what you're doing, the first few rounds are the easiest ones. Those are the ones where it's just like, okay, I'm just going to take the best player. I kind of know where I'm going. After that, you react and you say, okay, now how am I composing my team? Then after you've composed your team and you're happy with it, now you say, okay, how do I get the most out of this team? And what you're really trying to do is you're throwing darts and you're hoping that one of them stick. You're hoping you hit 2 or 3 guys that are going to stay on your roster the whole season. Because if you can do that, you're winning, right? Because you've now got guys that are better than waiver wire, more than other people do. And so that's when you really dial in, is in these late rounds. And that's where you really got to pay attention, in my opinion. So that would be my biggest advice too, is honestly, these late rounds matter so much.
That's also where the latest rounds are where you're going to be able to target some pretty decent goalie tandems if you want to go that route this season, which could work in some leagues. Again, I feel like I'm kind of talking about the Islanders a lot. I usually don't, despite being an Islander fan, but Varlamov and Sorokin are a good duo, and they're both like 10th roundish or later. I feel like, I don't know where Saros is going, but Saros and Rene
he's going
seems like
around 11th.
Yeah.
Saros is going like 11th, Rene's 14th-ish.
There you go. So, Nashville again,
value.
Not fantastic or anything, but having both those goalies, they're not completely horrible.
No.
So, yeah, I think and Saros really was doing well at the end of the season there.
Yeah. So. And I mean, even as like just a flyer, you've got Matt Murray going in the 16th. You've got Cam Talbot going in the 17th. I don't like Cam Talbot, but in the 17th, he could become a starter. Minnesota could be better than we think. Why not?
Yep.
Worst case, you drop him. And that's another thing I think the last thing I'll mention here. One of the biggest mistakes I see normally in a draft is people putting way too much emphasis on the team a player's on.
Also,
one of the biggest reasons Anthony Mantha gets avoided is because he's on Detroit. If Anthony Mantha with those stats is placed on Toronto, he's going first round. Because it's Toronto and just because he's really exciting. Or maybe first round is a little bit of hyperbole, but you get my point. Not first round, but you understand what I'm saying. People avoid guys on bad teams. When you look at a guy like Matt Murray, absolute trash, Ottawa is. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
They have upside, right? But where do you find some wins here? That's what I always look at. I always look at bad teams and I think, how can they help me? And people are overlooking it, but what can he do for me? When I look at a guy like Matt Murray, I see a lot of saves. I see really high volume. And so I look at a tandem like Brandon's saying, the Islanders, and I see really good save percentages and wins, but not a lot of volume. So where do I make up that volume? Matt Murray. He gets you a ton of saves, right? And even with a guy like Cam Talbot. And again, with these late round guys, worst case is you drop them. So what? You're fine. Yep. It doesn't matter. But don't sleep on good players because they're on bad teams. Dylan Larkin, Anthony Mantha, some of the guys on Ottawa. I'm trying to think of some other teams. Maybe the Kings, the Ducks. There is some value when it comes to bad teams, especially when they're guaranteed starts, they're guaranteed ice time. That's where peripherals come from. Peripherals are simply a matter of how much time you're on the ice. If you're not on the ice very much, you can't shoot very much. So do you want a third liner on Tampa Bay who's not going to really do much for you, get the opportunities? Do you want the first line guy on the Ottawa Senators that's going to have at least opportunity to get you some peripherals late? I will take the first line guy every single day of the week.
Yeah. I'm in that boat usually. Depending. I feel like Blake Coleman is the... I mean, who knows? He's actually probably not great this season, but yeah.
Probably not. But he's the exception that occasionally will just kind of go off. And Raquel is going in the 17th round. You must love that, Mr.
I do.
You're a massive Raquel fan.
And
there's a lot of good value this year. I'm very excited to go over all these teams because I'm going to be able to talk about a lot of these guys and give some suggestions. I'm excited. That's the next thing that's coming. We're going to be talking about sleepers and busts and rookies, and that's good. All that good stuff to give you the people you should be targeting. Then we'll go over every single team in the league, talk about all the players that are fantasy relevant on them, and give you what we think we project them sort of in the season, where we're taking them, what we expect, would we reach for them, would we not reach for them. I'll give you a hint. We love Oliver Bjorkstrand. That's one of our number one targets of the season. I think he's make or break for Columbus. I think he's the most impactful player on the Columbus Blue Jackets this season, aside from Pierre-Luc Dubois.
I think,
and the goaltenders.
There's a lot of just stupid value. This, the sleeper episode is going to be the least research I'm going to have to do for any episode we've ever done.
Same. I'm so excited. Seriously,
yeah.
That's going to come later this week. So definitely pay attention to that. We're going to have a lot of names for you in the sleeper episode. You're going to have a whole list. You're going to be able to go into your draft with the whole list of guys that we like that would work in almost any league late, honestly. And I can almost guarantee you that we did this last year. We told people, we're like, I'll guarantee you this guy's going to drop. And they did. I forget. There was quite a few names. You could go back and listen. And there was a lot of names that we said, Darnell Nurse and guys like that we were like, trust me, they will drop to around the 10th round and you're going to want them. And that's what happened. So we'll do that again for you this year. It's going to be exciting and fun. So anyways, thank you for listening to this episode. I am Gamby with my co-host Brandon. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next episode. Are we going to do sleepers next? We should do sleepers next.
Sure. Talk about it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to go sleep. Think on some sleepers. Then come back and tell you some sleepers. Brandon hates puns, by the way.
I do.
We will catch you next time.
All right. Thanks for listening.